Hiya. Thanks very much. I'm sorry I missed the Welcome to Country this morning, so I do just want to acknowledge the custodians and always owners of the country on which we're meeting today. It's lovely to be here. And I'd also really like to thank the OLT for inviting me to speak, but also for supporting the network that I'm talking about. And so there was already a bit of an introduction about me. I'm a Wiradjuri woman. I'm a senior Indigenous researcher at Batchelor Institute, and the work I do around teaching and learning is mostly in research training, and it's thinking about what's happening at a national level across research training, and thinking particularly about the process of the kind of a long career. I work in alternative dissemination contexts, so in particular my work is in the creative arts, but I'm also very interested in the kind of reporting and other processes that form that pathway towards research. The work I've been doing with the network, and there you go, potentialities is a bit of a daggy old word, but it's partly because we're still in the really early stages of this network. And there is a physical presence, a web presence for this, and it's just listed at the top, and I've got a handful, but if anyone's interested in them, they're down here, a handful of DLs that redirect to it, but this is the website that's up. And it's a resource shed. So I'm going to read off the page. I don't normally do that, as most of you that know me know, but I want to make sure that I've covered a little bit of ground around the formation and the structure, and particularly the issue of what the Indigenous Studies discipline is. So you can see that it's Australian Indigenous Studies Learning and Teaching Network. There hasn't been anything like this. There have been a whole lot of spaces where Indigenous academics have been able to congregate. But in talking about what Indigenous studies means, we've started to unpack a whole lot of issues around, first of all, what it means to start to talk about a discipline that actually isn't framed as a discipline in a whole lot of ways. I don't know if you know, but if you look at field of research codes under ERA, there isn't actually anything that defines Indigenous studies. You can't work in that area. You can work in the disciplines and then into that area. Whether that changes or not, and the Brent report suggests that, is something that I think we just have to wait and see whether that's actually going to happen. But part of where we've come to discover is that it probably won't, because it probably can't. So the Office for Learning and Teaching, it supports a lot of projects, and you've probably heard about some of them. There's a kinship project happening at Sydney Uni, which is around talking about kinship in specific disciplines, so it's crossing law, education, social work. They're really important. It's important to get this work happening in the disciplines, but a whole lot of academics within institutions work in an area that's defined. Indigenous academics at major universities, at least, are working within these large cohorts that are usually defined within some kind of discipline area. And so Indigenous studies isn't history or social work or education. It's all of these things. It's health sometimes. And so recognising that, trying to come up with a resource shed that was actually going to be meaningful for that was really tricky. So I've been really fortunate to participate in a whole lot of the OLT work, and in 2011 this network was set up, and it was focused on scholars engaging in key discussions around this idea of Indigenous studies, and I can tell you we probably spent a year as a group trying to work out what it was, even though all of us had been teaching it for about 20 years, or more. So the network combines leaders and early career academics, and it really does in terms of the formation of this smaller network that was around 20 people. But it then went out to a larger network, and obviously none of this works if we don't have a website and if we don't have a space where we're able to share this information with people who aren't linked in some meaningful way. So it's we're looking at sort of these key issues, but we're also looking at what effective teaching and learning is. So it's not just a resource shed to say, here's some stuff that you can use. It's also trying to unpack what good teaching and learning means within that space. So the people who've been involved with it include Professor Martin Nakata from Uni of New South, Dr. Heidi Norman from UTS, Importantly, Professor Deborah Cheetham from Willan Centre at the VCA of University of Melbourne, so that's an example of somebody who sits outside of what would be framed as Indigenous studies normally. Dr. Kate Barney and also Associate Professor Liz McKinlay and Professor Cindy Shannon, all from UQ. And there are other people from UQ involved with it along the way. And there are a lot of other Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues who are working into that space. This isn't a resource that's for Indigenous academics only. This is about content and it's about support across the space. And so it went from being this very narrowed idea to being what it needed to be, which was a support network. So we're doing that thing of strengthening engagement and sharing teaching and learning tools, and that's what we see here. But it operates within and outside the areas that are framed within the Indigenous studies area, and so not only because it's going into the disciplines, but because there's this whole notion that we want to support, and that we came to the conclusion as a network that we wanted to support, and that a whole lot of reports, including the Berendt report, suggests that we really need to encourage the embedding of Indigenous perspectives within the broader disciplines, and across the university. But that's really hard to do, and it's quite a burden on people who don't have that scholarship. And so part of what we were trying to do was not to just provide it as this kind of look up this stuff and you'll find this and you can read this, but to link people together and to find a way that they can form these cohorts. One of the biggest problems is that even though we may even find with very large universities that the cohorts within a discipline, within an Indigenous studies context, are 2 people or 1 person. And that's what we found as we did a review. And actually even finding that was impossible. And so the really good news is that this space, we now have that information there. So if you don't know what sub-disciplines are happening, if you don't know that JCU Indigenous health is really important, or Newcastle Indigenous health is really important, you can find it out. And it's surprising how many people who aren't coming from those disciplines but that are teaching into the Indigenous space don't know that. So it's also important because there is an absolute mismatch. And if you think about the people who are the senior Indigenous staff at your institution, the majority of people move up very quickly into these very senior positions where they're no longer doing teaching and learning work, and they may not even be engaged in research training in a really meaningful way. And it's really important for us to have that. It's important for us to have Pro-Vice-Chancellors Indigenous. But it's changed the landscape, and it's very different to what's happened in mainstream contexts. And so you have a lot of emerging academics who are doing the work of developing these programs. So they're not sessional teachers, they're coming in as full-time staff and they're developing this work. So the sector-wide questions, look, this is why the OLT is really important. And this isn't just a promotion of the OLT either, but it's really important because smaller universities or smaller cohorts within universities are not going to be able to invest in something that's going to be helpful across the sector, but the OLT can. And it's really important then too that the competitive edge, the competitive information, and quite frankly there's an enormous amount of IP work up here that's just been given over by these academics who are really kindly allowing the material to be made available, but a whole lot of universities said, I don't know why you're doing this. And as this network opens up, we want more information that's happening, and we want more information that's available, and particularly across the disciplines. So it's a difficult issue, this issue of the discipline process. The review of higher education access and outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which some people call the Berendt Review, Larissa Berendt put it together, it provides this enormous challenge because it not only recognises that workforce issue, but it recognises that Indigenous students and Indigenous academics are often ghettoised into only teaching Indigenous programs and only getting trained up in those. And it worries that the disciplines are actually not filling out. And so there's a whole lot of concerns with that if you then try and seed information across the disciplines. The amount of times I've had somebody who's in the STEM area come up to me and say, this is great, but how do I put it into science, or how do I put it into maths? And I mean, my problem is, or how does Indigenous knowledges actually incorporate this at a national or international level? And there's an answer to it, but I've got a PhD in art. I've been teaching for the last 22 years as an academic in a very specific discipline that I think of as really widely framed, but I certainly don't think of it as that widely framed. And I don't have that background. But for all of you, you know that you've got Indigenous academics at your institution who are sitting on committees having to speak around a whole lot of disciplines that they don't come from, and not having that kind of embedded support. And so part of this is being able to link them up. They're sitting on an ethics committee and they're trying to work out something in the health area, but it's not their field and they don't have anyone at their institution. Who can they talk to about it? Who is available? And so the network becomes enormously important in a way that I actually think it isn't across many other disciplines, and part of it is because it's not a single discipline. And so we kind of nutted that out. We've got about 100 members at the moment, and I'm hoping after today we get other people joining up. And even if you're just interested and you just want to be able to grab hold of the resources or make some kind of contribution about what's missing, we'd love to hear it. Often, if we don't have access to the information about the disciplines in this country, we can look internationally. STEM is a really good example. The US has an enormous amount of work done by Native communities there on what's happening in terms of Indigenous-focused work. And they've done a whole lot of groundwork on that. But do people in the disciplines here know that? And so we need to be able to act as a kind of a conduit for some of that, and that's part of, again, our brief. I think, again, one of the most important things about this, for all that it's great to have this kind of networking, it also remembers that we've got a fundamental problem that happens in institutions, and even as we have a whole lot more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have qualifications to teach and who are gaining their PhDs, we still have the problem that we have an enormous amount of academics who are asked to teach into an area that they don't know very well. And I don't think it would happen in a mainstream context, and it's a very vulnerable position for people to be in. And even sometimes being able to say no to that because, hey, look, see, they're teaching into it using my discipline in this other space, is part of what we need to provide. So while there's a lot of people who are writing about higher education, and there's a lot of work that's being done around the importance of higher education, what we recognised was, and that's why there's a new issue of Australian Journal of Indigenous Education that actually talks about examples, was that people were talking very ephemerally about this. We needed to have examples, ways, strategies. And so there are actual, I've got them up. There are these actual packages on there that you can look at to get some modelling, to get some ideas that aren't just within the discipline. I mean, a lot of them are at the moment. A lot of them are in the discipline of education because actually that's who a lot of the people who participated were. It was very East Coast centred. We knew that, but that can't be the future of it. And so part of it is that we need to have a space where we can understand this, and we need to have a space where not just emerging Indigenous academics trying to teach into this space can learn about processes that they don't necessarily know, can understand a little bit more about the teaching practices at other institutions. But we also need to be able to do that and seed that information for the disciplines and for people, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous in that space. We've also, one thing that I guess I haven't talked about, but I'd like to kind of finish with it, and that's, there's a real concern about learners. This isn't about teaching, obviously it's about learning, and there is a growing concern that learners within universities that aren't enrolled in an Indigenous studies program feel as though they're being forced into learning about Indigenous contexts. And sometimes they are. And sometimes it feels like it's grafted on. And part of the problem is, you know, you've all been to a discussion where you talk to someone who's not in your discipline area, and you have a conversation that's up here, but you don't get into the nitty-gritty because they haven't read the work that you've read. They don't understand that. And so if I come into an engineering program and I start to talk about Indigenous ways of being and knowing, it's going to sound very surface, and it's not going to have that kind of, you know, in-depth knowledge. And so part of it isn't just about seeding that, it's about genuinely understanding that we need to have those discussions because it's the only way that we will grow more Indigenous academics who are working across that area, or non-Indigenous academics who are interested in what's happened in that space. And so I think that they become the key concerns for us. We want this to be an expansive space, obviously at a moment where we're thinking about reducing this and reducing it and trying to come up with a what is Indigenous studies. We did quite the opposite, and we discovered that it was a lot of things, and that was actually okay. You know, it was okay, but students needed to know what kind of a program they were enrolling in. Teachers needed to know, people teaching these programs needed to know what was available across their institutions and why people were making these choices. And so the next stage of what we're doing with the network is really being able to understand the landscape of each of the universities that has these Indigenous programs. And it's where we've started to do a bit of analysis in an upcoming, a second AJA, Australian Journal of Indigenous Education. We're starting to worry some of that as well. So thanks very much. I think that's it.